Okay, so I have been recycling skateboards and making things out of it for the last 8 years now. And today I have some special stacks of skateboards. Most skateboards are made out of 7 different layers, and depending on the brand, maybe 1 or 2 or 3 layers have colors. But these skateboards have 4 layers with colors, and they're all red. And all 9 of these skateboards have the same layer of colors. And it is extremely rare that I have a stack of red skateboards like this. And when I think of the color red, I think about the Supreme logo. It's super red, an iconic logo that also relates to skateboarding. So it makes sense to make a Supreme logo out of these bunch of red skateboards. So first, I took the grip tape off using my D-Gripper 5000. The heat loosens up the adhesive and makes it so much easier for me to take it off. I'm also using a dowel to roll the grip tape off all in one piece and makes it a whole lot easier. And this is a part of recycling skateboards that I think I have it down pretty good, and I don't think any improvement is necessary, but let me know in the comments what you think. Once I have all the grip tapes off, I chop the skateboards into 3 different sections: the nose and the tail, the hardware pieces, and the middle section. And for this project, I'm only going to be using the middle sections. And check out my other videos on what I do with the other parts of the skateboards. Now, when it comes to sanding skateboards, there have been a lot of suggestions on how I should sand them down to bare wood. And honestly, I haven't found the best solution yet, but I just want to point out few popular suggestions that I read in the comments and how it's not going to work for me. First, some people suggested that I use a drum sander. Well, this is not going to work since skateboards are not flat. Not only that, you're going to clog up the sandpaper after, I don't know, maybe 2 or 3 passes. So now you just ruined your skateboard and the sandpaper on your drum sander. So that's not going to work. Why do you think I'm buying the cheapest flap disc to sand these boards down? The finish and the graphic really clogs up the sandpaper, so something that's easily replaceable and cheap would be a smarter choice for sanding these boards down. Secondly, some people suggested that I sand the whole board down before I chop it up. This doesn't make any sense because why would I sand all the parts that I don't need and do more work than I need to? This is like saying you buy a box of apples and peeling all of them before storing it. Those apples are gonna go bad. And this is the same for these skateboards. The finish and the graphic and the stickers actually help preserve these skateboards and doesn't dry them out. And lastly, the sandblaster people. I don't know enough about sandblasting, but I do know you need a lot of equipment. Heavy equipment. Just take a look at my tiny little battery operated air compressor. It just doesn't make sense in my small shop. Also, it seems like it's gonna be more work since I would have to take off the gloves to put in a new skateboard to sandblast, and so this doesn't really seem like an improvement to me. So I just want to thank everyone for leaving your suggestions, but they're really not good, and you really haven't thought about it enough. Now, since I'm planning on using this angle grinder and cheap flap discs, the best way to improve my posture seems like I need to raise the table a little higher. So I made this little jig to help hold the skateboards at an angle and just slightly higher. I'm still trying to find the best height and the angle so I'm not straining my shoulders instead. This does feel a little better, but I'll try to find the best angle and height and report back to you. And after sanding, I could do something called the tax cut, which is cutting off the edges of these skateboards. I saved these 1/4-inch strips for one of the skate shop owners who makes things out of these for their sponsors. And it also gives me a nice straight edge for the next part. Next, I can move on to cross cutting. These middle parts are roughly 14 inches long, but if you look towards the end, it curves up a little bit. So I cut them down to 12 inches, which I found it to be the sweet spot for having the straightest part of the skateboards without cutting off too much at the ends. And it also helps me calculate things since it's just a foot per strip. And after all the cutting, these are the offcuts, the tax cut, and the edges. Next, I could start cutting them into strips. I set the fence 3/16 inch away from the blade and start ripping. I'm using a push stick to have full control of the skateboard as I'm ripping it through the table saw. And I have these push stick files for free on my website, so make sure to check it out. And as I get closer and closer to the ends, I use another strip to push the skateboard against the fence so I get a consistent cut as well as avoiding kickback. I really should be wearing an apron for this task, but I guess I didn't feel like it that day. I'm also bundling all the skateboard strips together from each skateboard so that I could get a consistent line through the entire logo. Even though they're the same color and pattern, different manufacturers use different dyes and veneers, so there's slight difference to each of these boards. You'll see what I'm talking about later. Once I have all the boards cut into strip, I can get started on laminating them together. I have some 3/4 inch pre-finished plywood laying around, so I'm sanding off the finish so that I can glue these strips onto it. I'm also attaching a level for reference so I could get a straight line. I can then get started on pin nailing the strips. I lay down a line of glue and push the strips against the level and use a 23 gauge pin nail that's about 3/8 inch long. I'm also staggering the strips so that it's harder to see the gaps. And this took some time, so I put on a podcast and just get right into it. Now, I'm not sure when, but the pin nailer broke and the pins wouldn't drive in all the way, so I had to use a 1-2-3 block and a hammer to drive it in all the way. And eventually I realized it's taking way too long to do this, so I figured out a way to fix the pin nailer, and luckily the pin nailer came with the spare pin so I could replace it and it was good as new. I actually bought a brand new one and realized it comes with a spare, and I knew I put that spare somewhere when I bought it last time, and I found it after like 20 minutes of looking for it in the shop. So I returned the new one, unused, but I opened the box, so I guess this might have been a dick move. And after a few hours of pin nailing, I was done. I was hoping for these lines to be straighter, but once I have it sanded, it'll look a lot better. Also, I had a pretty decent amount of strips left over, so I'll make something later with those. Next, I can move on to carving out the Supreme logo. I'll be using my CNC machine to do this, and yes, my CNC machine is mounted on the wall. And believe it or not, this CNC machine is actually designed to be on the wall, just not in this orientation. And I have a whole separate YouTube video about it, but after years of using it like this, it still works great, despite some of you idiots that think it's gonna break. And once it's done cutting on the CNC machine, I can take it off and do a little bit of cleaning. I think I used a compression bit but didn't go deep enough to clear the upcut section of the bit, so that's probably why there's a lot of little fibers sticking up. Next, I can start mixing some 2-to-1 high performance epoxy from TOTALBOAT. Epoxy, epoxy, epoxy. If you don't have this epoxy dispenser, you do not get to tell me how to pronounce things. Pronounce. But seriously, if you use epoxy a lot, check out this pump from TOTALBOAT. It's really amazing, quick and easy, and you're never gonna mess up. Now, I'm tinting the epoxy white to match that iconic white font on the Supreme logo. Now, I'm not sure what I was thinking when I was tinting this epoxy. So, from what I know, there's a powder type of pigment and also the liquid type of pigment. The powder type pigment is the ones at river tables or the ones that look very flowy and almost has a marbling effect. And the liquid ones are the ones that are just flat and solid colors. And I knew this, but I still ended up using the powder ones, which made the epoxy look like a marble and not like a flat, solid white. So I'm kind of bummed out about it, but I'll show you later how I fixed it. Now, I should have waited until the white epoxy cured, but I'm Korean and apparently I have zero patience, and so I mixed up some red epoxy to fill any gaps between the strips. And luckily I got away with it and there wasn't any red epoxy mixed in with the white epoxy. It's the next day and the epoxy has cured, and I thought I poured enough white epoxy on the logo, but I guess I didn't, which kind of works out since I can pour more epoxy and mix the right pigment this time. I filled up the logo with the newly mixed white epoxy, and I was also very proud of how I mixed the right amount of epoxy and used every last drop. And it's the next day and the epoxy has cured again, and I was very happy with how solid the white font was. And now I can move on to flattening this. I'm using my CNC machine to do this since this is wider than my planer and my drum sander. Well, technically, I can do this with my drum sander since it's open-ended, but using a CNC machine is so much easier and less messier, and it's not going to clog up my sandpaper on my drum sander. And once I finish flattening it on the CNC machine, I can sand it with 100 grit to remove any tooling marks and make it nice and smooth. I can then cut it into its final size with the track saw, and I made sure that everything was square. I'm not sure why I didn't cut it all the way through with the CNC machine, but I cut it deep enough to have an outline, so everything worked out perfectly fine. And look how happy I am. Now, I can work on framing this logo and hiding the plywood edges. I had some white maple laying around, so I decided to use it for this, so I'm just ripping them into strips and cutting the miters for each one by one. And just looking at the footage now, I should really clean my blades. Just look at all the burn marks left on the strip. And once I have all the miters cut, I can laminate the strips onto the plywood with glue and clamps. I'm checking the bottom of the logo to wipe off any glue squeeze out since the bottom is pre-finished and I didn't want to have to sand it. Once the glue dried, I sanded it nice and flat with the drum sander. I had the maple strips a little thicker than the plywood just in case, so I had to do a little bit of sanding. And I actually had to sand the bottom as well, so I'm being very careful not to sand off the top veneer. And then I could get started on finishing. I first sand down the whole thing with the 100 grit sandpaper to get rid of any drum sander marks. And then I can round over the sharp edges with the router. And then I can hand sand to get rid of any tooling marks from the router. And then lastly, I sanded it from 100 to 150 to 200 grit to make it nice and smooth, and I was ready to put on the finish. Now, I'm using Rubio Monocoat since it's super easy to apply, but also very durable. However, I'm not really a fan of how satin it is. I feel like this finish kind of makes the wood a little dull, and I think I'm ready to try getting into more glossy finish. So let me know in the comments a good finish that's glossy but really easy to apply with zero risk. Now, you could probably just hang this on the wall and call it a day, but I wanted to make it more functional than just a wall art. So I reached out to my friends over at Semi Exact and they hooked it up with these sweet red bench legs, and they have so many different designs and finishes that you could choose from. So if you're in a place like me where you made an amazing tabletop but don't know how to weld or make a cool base, make sure to check out what Semi Exact has to offer. They have ready to ship items, but you could also custom order to the exact dimensions that you need. Thanks again to Semi Exact for hooking me up with these legs. Okay, so here it is, a Supreme bench made out of 9 red skateboards and white epoxy. I really like how it came out and everything went fairly smooth. Now, I actually made something like this a long time ago, almost 6 years ago. And things were a lot different back then, and I didn't have a CNC machine, so I routed the logo by hand, and I probably spent weeks or months making it. And honestly, I was just very grateful to have come this far and learned so much about woodworking and working with recycled skateboards. If you're interested in this bench or coffee table, whichever you wanted it to be, make sure to go check out my website, which is woby.design. And if you know anyone who's obsessed with Supreme, make sure to share this video with them. And that's it for this video. If you haven't already, it would be really nice if you like this video, subscribe to this channel, and hit that notification bell so you don't miss my next video. And lastly, comment down below whatever you want to talk about, and I'll try to include it in my next video. Thanks again, and until next time, bye.